Welcome, everyone. We will start today's webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join us here and take part in our session today. By way of a quick introduction, my name is John Rylett, and I have the pleasure of being the chair of the Decentralized Energy Canada board at the present time. And I also tend to act as the chair of the standards committee that you're going to hear about today. To make sure that our meetings run, as efficiently and as well as one can hope meetings can run. That's the goal. So we have a fairly full agenda that we'll work through as we go along. I will start though, before we get into the meat of our agenda today, just with a bit of a land acknowledgement for the session. Now, a number of us from DEC are based here in Calgary, so this will be focused on our local area, of course, with people joining from across Canada as well as potentially beyond. Your local Indigenous groups might be different, but because we're here in Calgary, I'm going to hit a land acknowledgement for this area. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we'd like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Ayaks and Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all of the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So we'd like to get that on the record before we start. With that, I'm actually going to hand over to our president of Decentralized Energy Canada, Anouk Kendall, who is going to give you a little more context on our standards committee, what the goals are, and how it relates to our organization. So Anouk, over to you.
Thank you, John. And actually, just a little correction there. I'm going to give you a little overview of Decentralized Energy Canada, the industry stakeholders we serve, some key definitions, sample of leading companies around the world, more of like a state of the industry presentation. And then Alicia will get into the, when Alicia's presentation comes up, she'll get into the goals of our standard steering committee and the program. So yeah, welcome everyone. I think there's a lot of you that I have not met that are on this call, so glad you could join us. As I said, I'm going to just give an overview of our organization and the market. We're going to take a brief look at, how the market's growing, the types of products that are in this space, the drivers, trends, and barriers. It sounds really boring, but it's actually very exciting. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll finish with the objectives of this meeting, which will overlap a bit with what Jesse and Alicia are talking about. So Decentralized Energy Canada is the National Industry Association for Decentralized Energy. Our primary goal is to connect industry stakeholders to opportunities that accelerate the sustainable, resilient, and affordable energy future. So we're a bit like a traditional industry association, that we're member driven, national not-for-profit industry association. We were established in 2002 when things were really slow in this space, but there was a lot of vision and champions and visionaries that helped start up the organization and get us on track with a business plan and a strategy that has served us for the past 20 years. We're a little unique in that we're not just membership revenue and events revenue. We do a lot of different programs and services. We provide services to the industry. So we do some international trade facilitation, industry consensus building, training and education, either through colleges and universities or to corporations directly. We help with project de-risking, providing a third-party service to communities that are installing community energy projects. Market research is something we should be doing a lot more of, and if we can start getting some more government funding supporting market research, it's critical right now. And then the events and networking. And although there are other associations that serve specific segments of the decentralized energy industry, like the Canadian Nuclear Association, the Canadian Biogas Association, Energy Storage Canada, the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, and Water Power Canada, We are the only national industry association that specifically addresses distribution connected or off-grid technologies. Next slide. So we've been around since 2002, and there were some pretty interesting years at the outset. We were established in Alberta with an industry group of over 200 people, including EPRI, the Electricity Research Institute. I've forgotten what the P stands for, and many of the utilities, but so much has changed, rapid evolution in this space. We now have over 13,000 subscribers, 20 years of experience, 105 members. We serve over 50% of the provinces and territories in Canada and represent over $32 billion worth of companies in our membership. And next slide. And just 2019, I would say, was when we started to experience some rapid growth. We'd always had a very steady growth in interest and engagement with industry, but 2019, we've really started to see the activity increase and a lot more players in this sector. So first of all, I just want to say that raising awareness of the drivers and benefits of this industry is critical, and building consensus around defining the terms that are used in this industry is also critical if we are going to manage growth and develop this market appropriately. Those are the education and awareness, and then understanding and agreeing upon the terms and definitions used are the two critical things. So Decentralized Energy Canada has coined their own terms. We define decentralized energy as heating, cooling, or electrical energy that is produced, managed, and or stored close to loads or the load. We encompass on-site energy generation, microgrid and smart grid enabling technologies, and energy efficiency measures. There's generally no capacity limit to decentralized energy, but typically less than 50 megawatts and typically connected to the distribution wires as opposed to the transmission. Although we do have some cogeneration or industrial decentralized energy systems that are transmission connected. So just to emphasize the importance of the definitions and agreeing to the definitions, coming soon through this work we are doing with the Standards Council of Canada and Standards Development Organization, we will be able to show you a national technical specification with terminology. Next slide. So if I can leave you with one thing, then we're not even halfway through, so I shouldn't say that. If I can leave you with one thing today, it's an understanding of how broad this industry is. So these are the technologies: district energy, cogeneration, solar, bioenergy, modular reactors, energy storage, smart grid, microgrids, earth energy. All of them, most of them have their own industry association. But as you can see, this is a very broad, this is part of the challenge with this industry, is it's a big chunk of products, technologies for people to comprehend. And I think it's Decentralized Energy Canada's purpose in life to make it easier to understand this space and in more digestible information. So the next slide. And just so the previous slide is a bit more straightforward in terms of definitions, what technologies are. But again, as I said, smart grids are not necessarily decentralized energy, because that's referring to the transmission and distribution grids, ICT, or integrated communications and automation to make to optimize the grid performance. We do work in the microgrid, mini grid, and nanogrid space. And again, to be determined by the SDO we work with on the National Technical Specification. DEC has created a microgrid definition using a couple of different sources. So we look at a microgrid as an energy system with electrical and thermal energy being required, and or with a defined geographical border. It can be a border, it can be a community or a campus, and it can connect to the larger regional grid, or it can operate autonomously in island mode, off grid. Mini grids and nanogrids, we've looked at the UNFCCC and the IEEE for their definitions right now, but again, to be determined whether we as an industry want to adopt these definitions. Mini grids are off-grid systems, or both off-grid, but a mini grid is more of a less than 15 megawatt, can have a few buildings together, but it operates off-grid. Nanogrid is typically within one building. So the next slide. So this is funny. I was talking to Alicia yesterday, and 5 years ago when I looked up market research documents and who's active in this space, it was really hard to find names of companies active in the decentralized energy space. Now, when I open up, whether it's distributed energy resources, decentralized energy, distributed power, smart grids, you're starting to see the volume of global companies involved with this. And if you even just do a quick scan, you'll see that there's computer companies, there's combined heat and power, fuel cells, hydrogen production, modeling and simulation of systems. It's very, very broad. Next slide. And again, the products that are dealt with in this industry are diverse. So we've got charging infrastructure, predictive modeling tools, reciprocating engines, wind turbines, solar PV, meters, substations. Covers a whole gamut. And that visual there is a good decentralized energy visual, but it's intended as a microgrid visual. But for all intents and purposes, this is, you have a number of different energy systems providing heat and power. And we are becoming, that green spot in the middle is becoming the anchor, the most important part of the decentralized energy industry. Your controllers, automation, integrated communication, predictive modeling, analytics, machine learning. That's kind of a visual on the kind of product side of things. Next slide. This is, when you ask why is the decentralized energy industry growing, why is it important, why should we be taking a closer look at it and supporting more of the market research? There's 7 main drivers. We have to address emissions on this planet. So global commitments to emissions reduction is a real thing, with 179 countries solidifying their climate proposals. The traditional electrical grid, I think everyone knows this now. It's expensive, limited functionality. And in many parts of Canada, you can have a kilometer of electrical line with as little as 3 customers on it. So that expensiveness is something that's really driving a change for how can we make it more affordable and then more robust to manage some of the other things that are going on in the other 7 drivers. The rise of prosumers is an interesting trend or driver to look at. Anybody can produce energy now. And we'll hit that in the trends as well. But this rise of prosumers and the democratization of energy is something we need to seriously look at, and businesses and corporations need to understand it well enough to figure out how they can serve that prosumer space. And again, just looking at the growth up to 919 billion forecasted for 2030. So big economy. Digitalization of utilities. Electrification and digitalization, massive opportunity. The World Economic Forum, I believe it is, has valued it as a $1.3 trillion space. And there's so much going on in that automation, machine learning, integrated communication space for utilities and for the prosumer itself. But the utilities are going to have to focus on beyond the electron. Lower cost, everybody knows this, the price of renewables is coming down, the price of energy storage is coming down by significant amounts. Extreme weather and natural disasters is perhaps the elephant in the room that we cannot ignore. It's causing most of the uptake in the decentralized energy industry, is that building resiliency, having to rebuild with extreme weather in mind, and how do we prevent buildings and infrastructure from being impacted by floods, wildfires, earthquakes, storms. So 2017 was a rambler of a year with $330 billion of losses due to extreme weather. And 2021 was 280 billion. And you just look at those numbers and it's unsustainable. So we've just finished a program with the Caribbean looking at how to rebuild after extreme weather there. And I think Canada can learn a lot from islands that have to build that resiliency. And electrification of society, it's a no-brainer. Everything's going electric, and the transportation sector is going to have the biggest impact. And these autonomous vehicles, if you think about data centers requirement for power and the 4,000 gigabyte of data per day required by one autonomous vehicle, there's definitely planning and strategies that need to be in place to support the electrification of society. Next slide. So trends, and these are kind of linked together, you know, because of those drivers, the trends that we're seeing is people rebuilding with resiliency. A big topic of conversation right now is 2 minutes. Thanks, Crystal. A big topic of conversation is insurance. So insurance companies can't afford to keep doing what they've been doing in the past. Parametric insurance is something we've been exploring with the Rocky Mountain Institute, just new models for allowing decentralized energy builders and construction companies to be able to insure their projects and to be rewarded for when they are integrating resiliency to extreme weather. So this is going to be a big space, that area of insurance coverage for decentralized energy projects. Everybody's going net zero. Everyone's got wonderful ambitions to be net zero. It's easy to have that ambition. It's going to be a challenge to figure out how we do that in a way that supports resiliency, affordability, etc. Microgrids is one of the key answers to going net zero. I believe that microgrids is going to be a backbone to the decentralized energy industry, as we were talking about earlier in the slides. Growth in energy storage, and energy storage, I believe, hasn't hit its big revolution. I think there's a number of different ways to use energy storage to support grid optimization. A number of our members have made a lot of progress over the past 5 to 10 years in energy storage for community microgrids, harnessing digitalization. And we've already talked about that, the linear to circular. So this circular economy, I think, is also going to be a massive area that requires attention, minimizing waste, reusing as many materials as we can. With the amount of internal combustion engine vehicles that are going to go to scrap, if we do not have standards and policies in place to make sure that the recoverable metals from those vehicles is used, we need to have policies and standards in place to make sure as much is reused as possible. And we need to be adopting more about where do we get lithium and rare earth metals, recoverable metals. It needs to be a bigger part of our conversation. And I'm on to my last couple slides here. Next slide. Our barriers, I've said this a couple of times already. There has not been I think because people don't really understand what the decentralized energy industry is, because it's so complicated, there hasn't been a lot of investment by government to produce publicly accessible market research. That needs to change. Raising awareness and education of what the opportunity looks like, what the industry looks like, the players in it, and the potential is essential. The traditional economic model, I don't know how many times we've gone into an investor's room and said, this community's got a great microgrid project, they are seeking some investment. Well, we don't look at investments that are under $100 million. That needs to change. The aggregate value of microgrids and decentralized energy needs to be considered by investors. And again, it's raising awareness of how that can be aggregated and how those business models can operate, instead of looking for the massive 3,000 megawatts, $3 billion projects. Traditional utility models, anybody can own energy generation. Beyond the electron, business models is where utilities need to go. And then the final barrier is navigating standards. And I think the panel, and Alicia is going to get into more of that. So I have one more slide, but I will leave it on that for Alicia and Jesse and the panel to talk about why navigating standards is a barrier to growth in this industry. And then the final slide. Just today, we have DEC would like to see 4 things come out of this session today: raising awareness of the role that industry standards and best practices play in project de-risking and sustainable development goals. I believe there's a great deal of industry stakeholders in our space that have not tuned into standards and best practices because it's been hard to navigate, and we're here to address some of those issues.
Right.
And then engaging a broader network of industry stakeholders to build industry consensus. So DEC has 20 years of a phenomenal network, but there's more people out there and it's constantly growing. So we want to grow that network. We want to support the standards development organizations by building industry consensus and maintaining open lines of communication with the SDOs as they develop standards or we adopt international standards. And then informing the policymakers of what's going on in the standards and best practice space, I think is essential for longer term goals. And with that, I am done. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Anouk. Actually, excellent segue to our next speaker, who is going to be Jesse Arndt, who is with the Standard Council of Canada, obviously a key player in DEC's efforts to look at codes and standards within the decentralized energy space. So I will turn it straight over to Jesse.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time today, everybody, and especially DEC for having me on the panel and the capacity to present Standards Council of Canada to your group. So I'll go through quickly a little bit of who we are, and then I'll finish up with what we're doing together on this work here. So my name is Jesse Arndt. I'm the sector specialist for clean technology at the Standards Council of Canada. My other hat, I'm also a lead assessor for the Standards Council of Canada's Standards Development Organizations program. So I'm well aware of the rules in which standards are developed. Not many of us know that, that world, but that's where I do specialize in. So I'm not an electrical expert by any means. I'm more of a standards expert. So next slide, please. So Canada's National Standard System is a framework for developing, promoting, and implementing national standards in Canada. Almost 15,000 Canadians help write standards, and hundreds of organizations specialize in testing, certification, and other standards development activities. SCC is a federal crown corporation, and we are responsible for overseeing the national standard system. We accredit more than 400 organizations involved in, like I said, standards development, but also product and service certification, testing, and management systems registrations in Canada. SCC regularly audits, and I see some of my oddities on this call here, we regularly audit certification and other standards development activities. So every year we're doing roughly about 200 to 400 audits, and we've been continuing that under COVID. We are a 15-member body consisting of representatives from federal, provincial, territorial governments, and a range of public and private interests, including consumer representatives, govern the SCC. So we are not governed by a government authority. We are governed by a council that is representative of your industries as well, Canadian. And standards establish a wide range of requirements for products, processes, and services. Now, there are over 4 million published standards globally, and it is really the job of the SCC and our partners to help Canadians navigate standardization in general. Next slide, please. So, talking about some of those partners, this is important and pretty much the first question we get asked, and I'll answer it right now. SCC does not create or publish standards. We coordinate and administer a Canadian national standard system for our stakeholders. This includes Canada's participation at international standards bodies. So the ISO and the IEC are our predominant international standards body that we manage Canada's voice for. Next slide, please. So our mutual agreements maintained with international organizations on behalf of Canada, it's fundamental in providing assurance that SCC advance the national economy, support sustainable development, benefit the health and safety of workers and the public, assist and protect consumers, facilitate domestic and international trade, and further international cooperation in relation to standardization. Next slide, please. So in order to accomplish that, our mandate really from our Standards Council of Canada Act, they've really provided us our pillars of function, standards, conformity, assessment, and accreditation. So from our mandate, we must promote the participation of Canadians in voluntary standards activities, promote public-private sector cooperation in relation to voluntary standardization in Canada, coordinate and oversee the efforts of the persons and organizations involved in the national standard system, foster quality, performance, and technological innovation in Canadian goods and services through standards-related activities, and develop standards-related strategies and long-term objectives. So that's from our mandate. Next slide, please. And those are the pillars of function. And so exactly what is Standards Council of Canada and DEC's interaction at this point? So to begin with, this work that we are discussing today and that DEC has embarked upon, this work is part of SCC's innovation program. This work was approved by all members of SCC's senior management team. So we are all aware of the scope of this work and the breadth of this work, and how it would teach, how it would touch each of our individual branches. And it was approved that this was good for Canada by our management team. SCC's analysis of DEC's organization provided confidence and excitement with respect to their Canadian geographical representation, including remote communities, technical expertise, Indigenous representation, gender balance, diversity, and focus on novel standards activities in the energy sector. It's mandated that SCC promotes standards participation in Canada, and DEC's application under our innovation program is intended not only to provide DEC guidance on standards engagement, but it also provides the national standard system with a new stakeholder that's engaging in novel works. DEC has indicated interest in incubating consensus work with respect to not only technical standards, but also environmental, social, and governance standards opportunities in the energy sector, which is very interesting, right? Offering up an incubator to help develop future standards work, national standards of Canada, and so forth. Really, SCC is happy to support DEC standards engagement activities, and we hope that the connections made in this work adds new perspectives to the Canadian energy standards ecosystem. And the next slide is a simple thank you, and thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Jesse. Really appreciate that overview. And just because we want to try to stay as close to our original schedule as possible, I'm going to go straight to our program manager from Decentralized Energy Canada, Alicia Couto, who is going to take us through the genesis of this effort and findings to date before we get into our panel discussion. So Alicia, all yours.
Excellent, John. Thank you so much. So as John mentioned, my name is Alicia Couto. I am the program manager of the Standards Committee here at Decentralized Energy Canada. Crystal, next slide, please. So we'll dive a little bit deep into what this project means, where we're at, and how you could possibly help us out in the future throughout this process. So DEC, in conjunction with the Standards Council of Canada, began this project in September of 2021, and it's a 14-month-long project with 3 phases. So we are looking to develop a standards and policy engagement roadmap to identify strategic relationships with relevant standards development organizations, or commonly also known as SDOs. And you'll hear that term thrown around here throughout this presentation. To seed some new work, mitigate duplication of standards, to collaborate together, and overall just to influence the standardization landscape in the decentralized energy sector in respect to the Canadian decentralized energy industry. So 2 of our main goals of this project are to produce a sector-specific standards and policy engagement roadmap. And this is kind of in conjunction with our targets of net zero emissions for 2050. How exactly are we going to reach those targets, in less than 30 years? And to also publish an industry-focused terminology of a national technical specification in conjunction with our standards development organizations, or an SDO. So Anouk had touched on this briefly in her presentation. We need common consensus on how we use this vocabulary in this industry. And so we're going to look to other SDOs internationally, as well as what we have here in Canada, so that we can develop a consensus-based vocabulary for this industry. So if you are here today, our steering committee, we had a think tank, and they've identified you, either you or yourself or your organization, as an industry expert, an SDO, maybe you're a governmental organization, a crown corporation utility, or anyone that may be in charge of policy in your respective field. So if you are here today, someone on our steering committee thought you were important and thought you should be here to listen to this work here today. So thank you for that. Crystal, next slide, please. Excellent. So this project has been categorized into 3 different phases. So phase 1 started in September, which is our standards and policy snapshot. So that is what we are here to present to you today. Today is the culmination of 4 months of work with myself, the steering committee, and Standards Council Canada, and of course Anouk's support as well. So what we'll be presenting to you today is our standards landscape scan and review, and then this is our policymaker engagement session number 1. So next week we will start into phase 2, which is our regulatory analysis. And what we'll start to do is look to international SDOs who have already created standards, both in technical sustainability and vocabulary terminology, and look to see what might be best to adopt within the Canadian landscape. And then our phase 3 will be to actually develop these policy roadmaps and standards roadmaps as to which of these potential standards that have already been created. If we can help mitigate having to create new standards and possibly just adopt ones internationally, that's usually the best practice according to Standards Council of Canada. So next slide, please. Excellent. So I'd like to introduce you to our steering committee. Our steering committee is comprised of 12 members, in addition to myself and Anouk overseeing it from the decentralized energy side, as well as Jesse, who is joining us from the Standards Council Canada. So it was really important to us to have a variety of experts from academia, government, Indigenous relations, the energy sector, including private and public entities, and ranging from a varied locales. We have representation all the way from the Northwest Territories all the way out to the Maritimes. And as many of you know, Canada has very siloed energy policies within provincial limitations. So it is excellent for us to have that representation, both from provincial mindsets as well as looking at things federally as well. Next slide, please, Crystal. Thank you. So the objectives of this project, as I previously have mentioned, we have identified 3 particular categories that we need to look at when it comes to standards landscape. So of course there are the technical standards, and we have some very talented and well-experienced engineers on our steering committee as well, who can really deep dive into those technical specifications. We recognize the importance of sustainability standards and best practices moving forward, how we're going to reach these 2050 goals and really truly build a sustainable world for all. These types of things are really important to include in this landscape scan, and then as well as that vocabulary portion, which I mentioned regarding working with a standards development organization to create a national technical specification that everybody can access, so that we're all using the same verbiage and same terminology when we're talking about the decentralized energy space. Next slide, please, Crystal. Thank you. So within our technical categories, and once again, all of these trends were coming from our steering committee, and we've had multiple opportunities to get together and provide kind of these think tank or just meeting to have these ideas of exactly where it is we need to be focusing on when it comes to technical standards within the Canadian landscape. So for this, we've identified 4 in particular, which were energy storage, microgrids, the digitalization of decentralized energy modalities, and of course metering as well. Next slide. And from a sustainability perspective, we want to be deep diving into economics and affordability of energy, of course, creating sustainable cities, responsible production and consumption or circular economy, climate action, of course, and then energy security, and in particular, as that relates to Indigenous communities in our country as well. Next slide, please, Crystal. Thank you. We also have committed to ensuring we are identifying these 10 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals as we begin our search for which standards should be adopted into Canada. So, of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, if you're not familiar with them, there are 17 of them, and it is all of these things are really important to consider as we move forward towards our 2050 net zero emission goals. Next slide, please. Excellent. So as I mentioned, we've been working with the steering committee, and we developed a roadmap, and we found 45 keywords that were used that relate to those previous categories. So whether it was energy storage, we were using words like battery storage, hydro storage, all those types of things. So we did find 45 keywords that we used in our search for what exactly is already in the Canadian landscape. So we did, of those 45 keyword search, we only found 10 relevant standards that are in the Canadian landscape. Of course, the Canadian Electrical Code appears to be the most valuable document when it comes to decentralized energy in Canada, and Section 64 in particular, the Renewable Energy System section provides both the direction for the installation of specific equipment such as inverters, stationary fuel cell systems, small and large wind systems, micro hydropower systems, hydrokinetic power systems, and storage batteries, and also includes the general requirements that apply to each of these mentioned systems. There are 2 ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization. So that's another SDO that we have internationally. So Canada has adopted 2 of ISO standards relating to sustainability. Next slide, please. So Canada is also active in 8 relevant IEC, which is the International Electrotechnical Commission. That's another SDO out there. So Canada takes part in 8 IEC technical committees and 2 of their subcommittees. As well, 11 ISO technical committees have also been identified that may be relevant to this project. So we will, begin to look into those technical committees and the standards that they've created and see if there's any congruency there of things that we can adopt within the Canadian landscape as well. So Canada is participating in 9 relevant ISO technical committees. We're acting as secretariat to the Hydrogen Technologies Technical Committee, which is TC 197. And notably, we are absent from both the solar energy and natural gas committees at ISO. So there's 2 IEEE technical committees that are also relevant to this project. However, there may be more. We have spoken to a few people that are working with IEEE, and we hope at our next policymaker engagement session that they can perhaps provide us with some insight into the standards that they've been working on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's some other relevant ITU, which ITU is the International Telecommunications Union. So they have some work areas that have also been identified within their SDO as foundational to all global information communication technology and interoperability, as well as we have identified 10 other industry standards and other relevant bodies that were identified throughout this landscape scan. So in the end, our steering committee may wish to consider the adoption of 1 or more of these international standards, and that's kind of the hope throughout the length of this project, that we are able to come back and say, we've identified XYZ of these international standards that we think would really help move Canada's needle towards a more sustainable future. Next slide, please, Crystal. So as I just mentioned, our next steps and kind of the results of these findings were, so within the technical standards landscape, we have recognized that technical standards are very robust in Canada. However, there are some gaps, and you mentioned that at the top of the hour, that there are gaps when it does comes to these types of things, and this is what we're looking to fill in these gaps through the life of this project. As far as sustainability, standards incorporating sustainability are definitely underrepresented in the Canadian landscape, and this is work we're really hoping to develop over the next, I was going to say 14 months, but we're already 4 months in, so 10 months. And then, of course, that vocabulary section as well. So we are working to develop a national technical specification with an SDO using a list of identified keywords by our steering committee experts as well. Next slide, please. So that is it for me. I will hand it back over to John to begin our panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Alicia. I'll just let the screen settle in there. So yes, we will move on to the next piece of our program today, a little bit of a panel discussion. Part of the genesis of this was, and I think Jesse touched on it earlier, was stressing the importance of having a very diverse group involved in the development of codes and standards to make sure that we get a broad cross-section of opinion, thought, and input into those processes. So we put together what we hope is a broad and diverse panel to have a little conversation today. I will suggest if you do have a question about this, if you wanted to type it into the Q&A, we'll do our best. We probably can't get to all questions, but yours may come up as a paraphrased question or something like that if we can. So please go ahead and do that. But to kick off, we will start with a bit of a roundtable and some introductions. So in no particular order, maybe I'll go to Brent Harris first to do a quick introduction and spend a minute or minute and a half or so just giving his view on codes and standards from his perspective as a technology developer. So Brent, I'll give the floor to you.
Thanks, John. I'm Brent Harris, founder and executive vice president here at Iguana Technologies. We make residential energy storage systems. Our core technology is actually the power control system or inverter that connects any of these distributed energy resources to the grid. We've been in the business for over 2 decades now. It started back before there was IEEE 1547. I was actually on the first committee for the first edition of that standard just about 20 years ago. And so we've been following the development of these standards around the world and complying with them. So we sell our products primarily in the United States, Germany, and Australia. Each of these countries has their own requirements. They started out quite divergent, and as you get over time, everybody's fundamentally trying to solve the same problem. So we're seeing a lot more alignment between different national standards than we saw 20 years ago, where everybody was just trying to start out and figure out how to get a few of these distributed energy resources on the grid. And now it's really more about orchestrating how they work together, and everybody's built up a good fleet. I've found at the beginning, we found it a frustrating process to go through as you're trying to get a new industry off the ground and having all this uncertainty and changing standards. But over time, I kind of appreciate where it's brought us to. And having participated over the last 20 years, we think we've got a pretty good handle on it, on the fundamental requirements, and participating in the standards development has been a big help. I think a key thing for us as a manufacturer, what we always look for is let's get to what is the root problem here, and can we come to a set of common standards that are going to work in the broadest geography possible, because that lets us standardize the product. You get much better product reliability. You get standardization of installation and training of the installation force. So we see big differences. For example, in Germany and Australia, most standards are national, whereas in North America, they tend to be regional at the state, provincial, or even county levels. And that just creates a lot of complexity and actually drives higher cost of deploying these technologies. So I guess I'll hold it off there. That's my top level view of standards and their importance to our industry.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Brent. We'll just work our way across the slide is there. Now, we heard from him earlier, but Jesse, if you wanted to just throw in a couple of thoughts to kick off our panel here, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I'm still Jesse, still work for Standards Council of Canada. Standards for me, I've been doing, assessing standards development organizations for almost 5 years now, and it's been a big learning experience. And standards are not created equally. They're created by those who participate. And really, to me, standards are not documents. They're really just evidence of a decision that was made, on a particular day with a body of evidence. And that decision or those instructions within that document can be modified at all times. So really, like when I think of standards, I think it's consensus. And the definition for consensus, according to the SEC, is general agreement characterized by the absence of sustained opposition to substantial issues by concerned interest, and by a process that takes into account the views of all parties concerned and reconciles any conflicting arguments. So as I go through, my work at Standards Council of Canada, and somebody calls me because, a manure management practice is not, not sustainable in their view, or an electrical standard is not sustainable in their view. I'm not technical, like I said. I don't see that their issue is necessarily stopping with the Standards Council of Canada or our partners, including the SDOs. I think what it is they're asking to be part of our system. And that's what standards is it is an inclusive and encompassing system that adopts your own opinions, but it also forces you to take considerations of others. And so for me, what the standard system provides is a venue for consensus. And I think that's really a sales point for many industries, is just like, can we get through this question to move to the next step? And to me, that's what standards is. And Brent kind of mentioned that is where we were yesterday compared to where we are today. Very rarely do we hit a standard that's so perfect that we never change it. It has to go through a maintenance cycle. And that to me is what standards are, is a continuation of a conversation and appropriate rules to make sure that those decisions happen. It's how we move forward. That's what it is to me.
Excellent. Thanks, Jesse. Moving along, I would like to introduce Michael Dewitt. I know Michael from a chat the other day has a long and extensive experience in codes and standards. So I will invite him to do a more thorough introduction and give some of his perspective.
Sure. So Michael Dewitt, I've been in, I guess, the work with SDOs, if you want to use that term, since 99, so 22, 23 years now. And I've been involved in what's called ISO TC 301, which is, and I'll use a little term that sooner or later you want to know, is the concept of a mirror committee. At least in the ISO world and also in the IEC world, as far as I know, you have the international committees, and then within each country, you then have something that's either directly called a mirror committee or the equivalent to that. Essentially, within each nation, there is another committee that functions at a national level. So when meetings I chair nationally meet, we talk about what are the issues for the country, in this case, Canada, and what do different types of stakeholders see as beneficial, see as a problem with the standard? How do we ultimately want to move forward with the standard or not? And how do we drive that process? And then participating internationally, we then help to influence what an international standard looks like. But the key is to always get that engagement down at the marketplace level, is the term I'll use. Because if a standard does not reflect what the marketplace needs and finds useful, the standard A won't be used anyways, and B will actually potentially become an impediment to that marketplace. So this is where the people, to 58 participants right now, are the marketplace in many ways, or certainly have connections to the marketplace that are on this call today. This is not a process that a group of 5 or 10 individuals who may be very smart should be developing standards. The more engaged the marketplace is in developing a standard, the more likely the standard becomes what the marketplace needs. And that's sometimes hard. And it's also why at least one person has commented in the last hour how the standards development process tends to kind of drag out. It takes a long time to develop a very collaborative standard that is built on consensus. Consensus isn't quick, unfortunately. It takes time and it takes a certain amount of effort. But the reward is you get a standard that actually helps people. In my work, that's what really matters. And I do this all as a volunteer. I have a real job besides being a chair of a management committee. But ultimately, a lot of the people that help develop standards, they don't get paid to do this. They do this because they see it's important for, in our case, the Canadian economy, Canadian industry, and ultimately participation is its own reward if you go at it with that kind of a point of view. So the more engaged, the more participative people are in how a standard gets developed, the better the standard becomes. It helps from the industry side to the public side, sort of public interest side. All of these different aspects get taken into account, which is why it was very good to see one slide that was up earlier that showed that the group that's working on this project comes from many different sectors, from the government side, from the industry side, from the academia side. You got to have all of those things involved to get that broad stakeholder input. And that's sort of my speech for why standards matter. And
excellent speech,
I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done not so good.
Great, thanks very much, Mike. And just to our last but not least panelist today, we've got to hear from a technology developer, Standards Council of Canada, Michael, who's been heavily involved in development of standards and international committees. And we are now going to go to Sarah Mudge, who represents the utility industry and has a number of interesting things on the go. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you to give us a quick intro to yourself and how standards affect the work that you do.
Great, thanks so much, John. So thank you everyone for joining us today and engaging in this conversation that I find very important based on the work that I do. So a little bit of context, NB Power, we are the Crown Corporation owned by the province of New Brunswick that is responsible for providing reliable, low-cost electricity to New Brunswickers. And we are at 83% non-emitting today, and we are on track to be, fingers crossed, 100% non-emitting by 2040. So we're getting ready to enter this stage where we're going to start seeing that last 17% of our emitters coming offline gradually over the next 15 to 20 years. And we recognize that in order to meet the needs of our customers that we have to serve, that has to be replaced by something. So we've developed a plan that involves a combination of energy efficiency, demand side management, as well as DERs, which are very, very important to us. The challenge, of course, coming from 102 years of experience as a traditional utility where we did everything a certain way, we've designed and built the grid a certain way. How do we adapt the way that we do business, and how do we change the way that we interact with our customers? And so that some of the challenges that we're going through right now would be things like if we have a builder that's putting 100 net zero homes in the community, each of those homes has a 10 kilowatt solar array. That means that in a very small concentrated area, we have a 1 megawatt power plant for all intents and purposes. How do we integrate that 1 megawatt of solar into the grid? Are we looking at that as 1,000 different, kilowatts that we need to get on there, or are we looking at that as one integrated system like a microgrid? So we've undertaken some research projects, and I can certainly answer some questions about those later on. So we're looking to retrofit homes to add technology. We have a microgrid project where we're trying to onboard 75 net zero homes through a microgrid that is going to have solar panels on the roofs, batteries in the garages. And one of the biggest challenges for us from a standard standpoint is as a utility, we have to always be planning probably 3 to 5 years out. And one of the challenges that we've run into in trying to get ready to do some of these research projects is standards changing just as we're about to execute something. And unfortunately, we don't really have a roadmap that looks at the need to evolve standards and the need to evolve technology. and when we can anticipate that major changes would happen. So from a utility context, being able to plan around the evolution of standards so that we can better integrate new technologies into the grid, and understanding things like, like the rise of net zero homes. So if we know that the building code is going to be, fingers crossed, net zero by 2030, what does that mean to us as a utility for how we need to prepare for more of those types of homes and customers in our province and connected to our grid? So very happy to answer any questions anybody has, and see how this standards conversation plays out over the coming discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I know I'm always interested to hear what you guys have going on. It's always an interesting project, which is great. Maybe there's a question that we had thought about ahead of time, and there's a couple others that have come in, I think, in the same vein that I wanted to throw to our panelists here. And it really comes around to innovation and the ability to do things, and perhaps the perception that standards can get in the way of that in terms of holding you back and delaying progress. So it's sort of an open question to any panelist who might want to weigh into that. I see a hand from Jesse, so if you want to take the first crack at it, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And it is a great question. It's something that we as an organization have struggled with. And again, we've worked with our partners to try to accommodate this for the Canadian public. And it's only been in the last 2 years, I believe, that we've released a set of new deliverables. For the longest time, we were international standards bodies, national standards system, and then there was some other, regulatory interactions. But we had a bit of a smaller scope with respect to the amount of standards oversight that we actually took care of. But we've heard this, that standards are not necessarily accessible for innovators, and that those solutions need and sometimes the consensus requirements and obligations of getting a national standard produced were too great. So we have developed some deliverables, such as a Canadian workshop agreement, technical specification, which is being developed by DEC. And a few others that are kind of a subset of standards development that are kind of, like I said, again, they're incubator standard systems. So industry organizations can leverage these guidance documents as to how to develop their documents in preparing them for standards organizations, or use them at an industry level. So from our perspective, we try to accommodate innovation by allowing the standards system to infiltrate into your own publications. And so, and I'm sure that this can be shared, you can request it from ourselves or on our website, or maybe DEC would be able to help us get the message out if you message them directly. But there is a few of these deliverables that are below, I think, a level of national standardization that we kind of all have our scope on. And really, those are intended to help innovators start to understand, what would the framework of a standard look like? What would the maintenance program of a standard look like? What do I have to put into this document? What do I have to keep out of this document? Or how do we generate consensus in an ecosystem? Sometimes that is not best done by a standard, but it's best done pre-standards work. So what SCC has been doing to try to encourage innovation is things like this program is an innovative program, but also the long-lasting, and forever documents, hopefully, that now exist for not only our SDOs to use, but also every Canadian out there, every organization. They are not meant for large, small, medium enterprises. They are all inclusive. And, community source documents, stuff like that, real interest. I saw a bunch of questions on open source standards. We have a community source document now. So we do hear those bells ringing, and we are trying to react, as quick as government can, but maybe a bit quicker.
So maybe I'll just look to any other panelists who might want to talk about I'll call it maybe the tension between sort of innovation and codes and standards. Any other comments that you wanted to throw in before we move to the next topic? I see Brent's hand, so Brent, go ahead.
I can just give a little more color on the history over the past 20 years with the grid interconnection standards that we've seen, starting from back in 2001, where I went to the first meeting of the IEEE 1547, and a utility from South Carolina had sent a couple of linemen with like their belts and tools and all their gear to the meeting and talk about how they didn't want their friends dying out there when you hook up these solar PV systems to the grid. And that's, that was the real concern then. And utilities were concerned about this new stuff on the grid. So the standards started out being very conservative and very like hair triggers on tripping off. And I guess the war story from that one is the same thing was going on in Germany. And the utilities there said, well, if the grid goes above 50.2 hertz in frequency, there must be something terribly wrong. So we want all these crazy solar systems to be off the grid. There's some pushback from the manufacturers who said, okay, all these PV inverters go out, and lo and behold, in 2010, you have megawatts of solar out there and a whole bunch more wind coming on the German grid, and the frequency started to fluctuate a little bit more than it had historically. And suddenly you would have an event where 2 megawatts of solar is dropping off the grid all at once because of this hair trigger. They adapted the standards. It's all now, when we talk about it, it's about ride through, and we're being pushed to stay connected to the grid as long as possible without damaging the equipment. So the whole idea driving the standards has changed over 20 years, and I think is where it needs to be now. I don't think you could have gotten there out of the gate. I think you need to develop a standard, try it for a while, see what works, adjust. But in the end, it cost, I think, 180 million euros to go and update the settings on 400,000 PV systems in Germany to correct that problem. But I guess that's part of standards development.
The real world evolution of these things as we move forward. So hopefully we can see that process accelerate in future now that we have some track record in this space. Maybe if we can, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit to another topic. Anouk touched on it, and I think as did Alicia, but it's the idea of sort of sustainability goals being worked into standards that may have been in the past viewed as purely a technical thing. How do you hook up A to B and do it safely? I know, Mike, when we had a chat the other day in preparation for this, you mentioned that flavor coming up in some of the committees you're on. So maybe I could ask you to comment a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just a philosophical shift that when creating a standard or working on a revision to a standard, because we shouldn't always think of this as just a new standard. Sometimes it's how do we take something that someone else has created and adapt it, or literally overhaul something that was created. In the case Brent was talking about in the past, do we need to just change how we use the standard? And a big piece of standards has become the SDGs, is getting people who are working in the trenches of doing these things to appreciate what it means. What does it mean to think about how does this particular activity affect many other things in the world? Everyone who's a real technical expert on one piece of equipment or one type of how something gets managed is very good at that. And that's why they're on a group. But until they have someone kind of as a helper to help to appreciate, don't forget that when we produce power, it does these other things. We're getting better at it because of the fact that carbon is such a big issue nowadays that most people will sort of say, okay, have I thought about how does this affect carbon footprint? But when do we think about, how do I think about, well, what's the entire footprint of what happens if we do this? And then you can take into account many more things. And it's really just an adjustment in perspective. And another way to think of it is a lot of good standards don't just simply talk about how to do something. They talk about how that fits within the context of a greater world. Because that's really what the SDGs are. They're about the context within which that effort can affect other things and other aspects of the entire, ecospace, human space of where we live and what we do. And the nature, especially when writing a technical standard, is to say, how do I connect A to B, or, what's the right piece of equipment? How do I define how this works. But when we start to think about that in the bigger context of everything, and ultimately someone who is, shall I say, the CEO level has to do that all the time to survive as a business. The person who's the engineer who designs the piece of relay equipment typically doesn't. And they're the one writing the standard. They got to sort of think about, well, what would my CEO think about this from the point of view of the business, and how does my business survive? That's sort of a first step. And it just broadening horizons.
Interesting. So again, back to that broader context of developing, codes and standards. Maybe unless there's a panelist who has a specific thing on ESG in particular, I might put Sarah on the spot here, because I know in previous conversations that we've had, this broader context of standards has come up in the context of actually standards that perhaps fight against one another, or at least don't agree with one another. So Sarah, could I put you on the spot to talk about that a little bit, just with your experience?
Yeah, sure. And I don't know that I've come across standards that necessarily fight with one another. The challenge is just things sometimes evolving faster than maybe utilities are ready for. And so I can speak to a project that we have right now. So the one that I was mentioning earlier about, how it takes us a long time to plan things, as you can imagine. So the microgrid project that we're working on today, we really had to come up with, who are the partners, what's the technology that exists that can make this a reality. We had to go seek funding. And of course, when we're applying to ISEDC and NRCan for that funding, we had to essentially know what the solutions were that we wanted to put in market. So we were applying for funding back in 2017, got told we were getting funding in 2018, started actually putting together the plan and building the nanogrid controllers that were going to be connected to solar and battery and hooked back to a microgrid at the substation. And then when we actually went to procure in 2020, found out that the standards that we had used to design the entire system were now basically obsolete due to a communications update in 2018. So it really speaks to the fact that we almost need to be every 6 months doing a check and adjust, right? What's changed in the world is the technology that we had scoped 6 months ago, even still in the market, because there were manufacturers that we had reached out to that had technologies that had the communications protocols that we needed for our microgrid, only to find out that they were discontinuing those communications protocols. So now they would no longer work with the solution. So that was a really fascinating one for me in the evil engineering brain, to just kind of really think through, okay, we can put together a plan, but we really need to be always checking and adjusting and making sure that there isn't something newer, something better, something faster out there, and that the industry and we are still aligned. And prototyping and really being ready for the fact that, there is a new version of, a cell phone every 6 months on the market. That's what we have to start thinking about generation and about energy technologies, that it's not every 3 years, every 5 years that things evolve. It's within a year, something can evolve. A big one that happened to us that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for COVID that delayed the project. But we had gone into about 500 homes in 2019, trying to find 100 that would be compatible with solar and battery storage. And then unfortunately that got delayed because of COVID. And then once we wanted to actually go in and install the technology in 2021, the electrical code was updated. And we were now no longer allowed to install batteries inside homes. So then we had to throw that entire year's worth of work out the window, because we couldn't proceed with the installs that we were hoping to do once the electrical code had changed. So that's one that as a utility we're sometimes blind to. So, is there a change to the electrical code coming, and when is it coming, and when will it be adopted and enforced in New Brunswick? So it's really forced us to develop better lines of communication with the codes and standard bodies in New Brunswick, because if we're not aligned, if they're adopting codes or standards that our projects are going to be impacted by, we really need to make sure that everyone is aware of what happens when you change a code or standard. It 100% makes things safer and ideally better, but it can really derail major infrastructure projects. And we had a lot of customers that decided to no longer participate in the research with us because they were tired of the delays or of us having to go back and reevaluate and under new codes and standards and stuff. So yeah, that's been kind of a fun one for us. But again, to me, that really speaks to our need to be involved in things like the planning and the forecasting. So how do we as a utility get involved in the electrical code and what's coming down the pipe, in DER's communication standards and what's coming down the pipe. So there's a lot of relationships we need to build so that we can be better tapped in. So which is why I'm so happy to see so many people here participating.
Yeah, no, I think it just reinforces that, the broader the group involved, probably the better, having that industry input. I know personally I've experienced the same thing where perhaps the building code, the electrical code, fire code, what have you, the putting them all together, can make your life rather difficult to actually execute a project. Maybe to move along, we did get a question here, and I might be looking at Brent, but others on the panel, if you wanted to step in, just a question around the relevance of the CSA C22.3 number 9, which is the interconnection of distributed energy resources and electrical supply systems. I know this has come up in various discussions, but I'll throw it to our panel here just to get back to our listener in terms of how that fits into this broader landscape of codes and standards for decentralized energy. And Brent, I am kind of looking at you because I think you and I have had the most conversation about this, but others are more than welcome to jump in. Oh, Brent, I think you're still on mute. If we can get your microphone on there.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a bit of a challenge. Every country has their own standards and has a responsibility to their own citizens and industries to take care of them and make sure things work right. And there's certainly areas that things in Canada are different than they are elsewhere, and we need to deal with it differently to be safe. But I think it gets a little bit out of control sometimes. From a manufacturer perspective, selling an energy storage system, I would say if Canada was to deviate significantly from the requirements in the US, we would likely be forced to make a decision whether we're going to support that. And given the size of the market in Canada, it would be difficult. So from a national perspective, and even interprovincially, there's some benefit to coordination. The historical example of this is the fact that Canadian commercial buildings require 600 volt distribution wiring inside, 208 or 600, where the standard in the US is 208 or 480. What that means, for example, as LED lighting came out, Canada was 3 or 4 years behind deployments in the US because manufacturers, they see a 300 million person market in the US, say, let's try the technology there and we'll see if it works out. Maybe we'll think about Canada later on. So as you're looking at new innovation and technology development, if you make yourself a small little island, you may get forgotten by the manufacturers. So we see it right now. The standard that was mentioned there, I believe, is a new one. We typically certified to the predecessor. There was not a lot of difference between that standard and IEEE 1547, which is the guiding standard in the US. So it was easy for us to just do a few software changes and some additional tests in our certification and maintain cross-border certification. I expect that's going to continue, but I see some different developments on the battery side and battery safety that gives me concern that the people writing these standards are not, or authorizing, are not taking the full impact of those decisions into mind. If it becomes very difficult to install a battery system indoors in Canada, you won't get really any battery systems indoors because of our cold weather. You don't have the option to put them outside like you do in California, for example. Well, that's one perspective on that.
Definitely. I'll look to our panel. Anybody else that might have a particular viewpoint or thought on that particular standard, just because it was one that was mentioned in our Q&A? feed?
Not necessarily on that particular standard, but one thing that I agree with Brent on, and I think the national standard system does agree with Brent on, is that we avoid duplication. We have a duplication avoidance mechanism that we initiate in our national standards of Canada system, so that each standard is brought in and it is not duplicative to another. And there's a way for the standards development organizations to ensure that that happens appropriately. But he's absolutely right. Sometimes just because it's not duplicated doesn't mean it's not necessarily functional for stakeholders. So I with respect to that standard and its use, I'm not certain that maybe the standard needs to be modified, but I think definitely, when you look at the Canadian geographical representation, and does it make sense, or could this be a binational standard, or could this be other things? These are the areas where we can start to generate those questions and then bring them to those SDOs. And I think that for all the reasons that Brent pointed out, that it's important that this group explore those questions and bring those forward. Binational standardization is something that we can work with as a system. So even just getting together and us knowing that is important.
So thanks, Jesse, for the comments. Maybe we did have another question come in here that I thought might be worth getting on the table quickly. It's sort of the difference between guidelines or best practices versus actual codes and standards. And so, maybe I'd look to Mike on this, he's been involved in the codes and standards side for years. I think the question is, should we maybe be looking to, guidelines or best practice components because it can take so long to get a consensus standard? Maybe Mike, I'll throw to you on this, but to start, but pros and cons.
Well, I guess the way I think of it is if it's a guideline for something that we haven't had anything before, so it's sort of something that there is no standard for, there hasn't been any help, because standards should be helpful. It's the first rule. If it's not helpful, why the heck do you have it? So if a guideline would be helpful to industry to understand what the market needs, then a guideline can be a starting point. Of course, the question becomes one of, will a guideline be something that could eventually evolve into a standard? Or would a guideline always be the appropriate part for it? And keep in mind that some standards, certainly in the ISO world, they're designed, this is guidance on how to do something versus just a guideline on versus a requirement standard. So I realize there are a lot of electrical standards that are, you shall, there's no, you could type language. So a guidance, a standard can still be a guideline depending on how the SDO tends to write what they write. But a guidance document, which essentially helps provide industry with direction on where it, best practice is probably not a bad idea if there isn't a tremendous amount of consensus, or it's still at the stage of building, what's the best practice. Because that's always part of the problem is you can get guidance out the door, you can get helpful hints, if you want to think of it that way, out the door of consensus process probably a little faster than you can actually coming with a document that is a bunch of shall statements, and this is the way it must be done in order to be able to drive a market to a high degree of consistency. In some ways, it depends on what that is for. If it's a safety system, for example, you really don't want everyone sort of reinventing things and saying, well, I didn't like that guidance because, it didn't work for me. So it kind of depends on the scope in many ways of what it is you're producing. But guidance, and I've seen standards that start out as guidance, and then eventually someone says, okay, everybody agrees, this is a good way to do this. We're going to turn this into a bunch of shall statements versus a bunch of shoulds. That's my point.
Excellent. Enjoy the point of view. Anyone else on the panel that might want to touch on that one? I think maybe Jesse might be somebody. I don't know if you wanted to weigh into that, or has Mike covered it?
I always try to think of the standard system as Standards Council of Canada. If we are the skeleton, our standards development organizations are the muscles, and they are excellent at producing those types of guidance. It is those organizations that adopt our international standards and host those technical committees or mirror committees sometimes. And it's really those organizations that are quite astute and excellent at creating these guidance documents in collaboration with regulators, or in collaboration with industry stakeholders, or in collaboration with yada yada yada. From my perspective, my opinion, those documents are useful, but there is Canadian expertise in generating those types of documents, and it's those same consensus bodies using those same principles of consensus. They're going to help the industry produce those documents. And they can be produced differently than a traditional standard, a PAS or a publicly accessible specification or other, right? So that's the expertise that I would signal inside of our system. They've been doing it for many years and for many federally regulated programs, including implantable medical devices was a guidance document from the government. So they can work in these high-risk areas, and they do it extremely effectively.
Excellent, appreciate that, Jesse. So I think we're sort of getting to the end of our time slot for today. I did notice a question came in from somebody asking about some next steps. So actually, I might see if I could get Alicia as the project manager to come back on and give everyone just a quick little snapshot as to what comes next. And in particular, if what you've heard today piques your interest and you would like to be more involved in the effort, I think there is definitely opportunity for that. And so Alicia, if you wouldn't mind, I'll give you a couple of minutes to let everybody know sort of where we go from here, and if they have a particular interest to get involved in, how they might exercise that interest.
Absolutely. And Crystal, if you wouldn't mind throwing up that last slide just with Jesse, myself, and Anoop's contact information as well, where they can access Decentralized Energy Canada's website, as well as Standards Council, if they're interested in kind of learning more about these efforts. So yeah, as John had mentioned there, if this work, if this is really passionate to you, if this is something you have a high stake in and you want to get more involved, please don't hesitate to contact myself. We'd be happy to have your input, and we could talk a little bit more about how often the steering committee meets and kind of what the next steps for phase 2 and phase 3 look like. As an observer, if you are interested in kind of keeping tabs on this work that we're doing and what's next to come, we will be looking to set up another policy engagement session, likely around June, and then our final one probably in October of this year. So if that's of interest to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us as well. And if you have any further questions about what you heard here today, or wanting to kind of get more information about how standards can support your industry, you can reach out to us as well. We'll be happy to answer those questions for you offline today.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Alicia. And to anyone who did post a question that we didn't get to, we have tracked them. We will try to get some answers out if there's something specific. And we've, of course, noted them all down so that we have that context for going forward. Other than that, I believe we are at the time here where I'm going to say thank you to our panelists for the discussion, and perhaps me putting them on the spot a little bit as I thought of things and saw questions come in, as well as all the presenters today who went through, so Anouk and Alicia as well, to run that. Really hope that everyone who attended, that you got something useful out of this, and you have a little more perspective on not only Decentralized Energy Canada, but codes and standards development in that space, and also how you might get involved a little bit more going forward. We want to see engagement. I think we heard that today, that the more engagement from industry and the more participation, the more likely we are going to have good, useful, and purposeful, codes and standards come into effect in the spaces that we all work. So with that, I think I'd like to also say thank you to everyone who attended, and we'll give everyone a send off back to the rest of their afternoon. So thank you very much, and hope Hope to see you at our next update on this initiative.